Uh, First, I need to talk about me. I'm a Brazilian journalist, DJ, member of Masterplano Collective, and student of PhD in Communication and Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. Masterplano is a collective that I participate with my 7 members since 2015, and my research is about this electronic dance music scene. This contest is about this electronic dance music in Belo Horizonte and the relationship between the bodies of people, dancers, and the spaces of the scene, and about 2 important, significant moments. First, the Great Brazilian Disaster. There was a small nightclub that existed in the 1980s, and Masterplano, this collective music founded in 200 and is still active today. Masterplano, according Masterplano in this website, is a multicultural platform that articulates art, performance, architecture, fashion, and audiovisual around electronic music and LGBTQ+, activism. In addition to parties, the collective presents workshops, talks, debates, film sessions, and festivals. A little bit of history of Masterplano. This collective, created in 2015, has been operating for 9 years. Today, the collective has 7 members and 17 resident artists, DJs, performers, and drags, besides a staff team. Now, let's see some photos of Masterplano across the years since 2015, 2000. And these parties was in indoors and outdoors. In this place is a soccer field in Viaduct, in center of Belo Horizonte. It's a botanical park in Belo Horizonte. Now I need to talk about the Great Brazilian Disaster. I knew this club because I worked in a place and I had a boss that talked about the Great Brazilian Disaster. Her father worked in this place in the 80s. And this club was very important to electronic dance scene of Belo Horizonte. This club, created in 1988 and closed in 1989, had a resident DJ called Dr. Acid. This club was very important to Acid House. And this club was managed by Marcos Moisés, the father of my friend. And this nightclub received DJs, performers, a diverse people by the standards of the time. Brazil was in dictatorship in this time. And this club had a door policy and a single unisex bathroom in the 80s in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil. It was very different for this time. And Marcos, the manager, Marcos has bought some records and vinyls in countries like England and United States, and has invited the professional and amateur DJs to play them. In this time, Marcos came to Europe and bought these records and vinyls, and in Brazil invited some DJs to play them. And analog time. Now let's see some photos of the Great Brazilian Disaster. Marcos is the first in the first picture. This guy is Dr. Acid, DJ, performer artist, Marcos Moisés. In this work, I intend to discuss how the body and the party were reconfigured in the electronic dance music scene from 1988 until the emergence of the Masterplano collective from 2015. To elaborate the discussion, I intend to take a conceptual theoretical approach based on notions of experience, chronotope, and music scene. And in these notions, I work the notion of Will Straw. According to Will Straw, scene is extended to specialization of cities' cultures through the graphic of tastes or affinities to 5 physical locations. Within scenes, states, or affinities become organized as itineraries across series of space. And the notion of Bruno Leal, experience, it's a very condition for each person to learn, seek, discover, or recognize ourselves so that you can move and transform. Experience is something that transforms and modifies us in a localized time and space. In the notion of Mikhail Bakhtin, chronotope is a concept of literature to describe the inseparability of time and space in a text or discourse. The chronotope of electronic dance music was able to produce a certain sense of reality, like the Great Brazilian Disaster, in time Brazilian doctorship. About the experience, the lack of archives and studies on the EDM scene in Belo Horizonte does not mean that this story is not present in some times of material. Contrary to this material continues to be present in bodily experience, embodied and memorized orally. In this notion of chronotope, the chronotope of the Great Brazilian Disaster, with its musical expressions such as acid house, dark wave, and dance music, was by projecting utopias, space-time, but still within the catastrophe time-space of the end of dictatorship in Brazil, with the promise of an open democratic. 3 decades later, a group of friends created the Masterplano collective, the collective that I participate now, with a strong influence from the festive occupation movements of Belo Horizonte, such as Praia da Estação, Carnaval de Rua, and the echoes of history of Detroit, Berlin. This group claims the rave electronic party outside the nightclubs, institutional commercial nightlife environments. In this notion, Masterplano do parties, activities outside of nightclubs and create other atmospheres, other chronotopes, other artists. And the body, when I talk to producers and DJs from my city, Belo Horizonte, capital of Minas Gerais, from previous decades, such as Alexandre Ribeiro. Alexandre Ribeiro is a manager of the Puta Madre Club. There was a great identification of the EDM public by fixed locations, like clubs and nightclubs. After 2015, with the emergence of collectives such as Masterplano, 1010, Meia Transdura, Trem Base, there is a predilection for new and alternative plays outside to the clubs. In the Great Brazilian Disaster, this nightclub, for example, there was the practice of door police, a type of hostess who choose who should enter the nightclub or not. Very common practice in electronic dance music space in places in New York, Paris, Berlin, and Belo Horizonte, which describe practice that expose racism, classism, classification of bodies based on certain stigmas of bodies. The body is immersed in language, saturated with signs, as if it were a code waiting to be deciphered. The transformation of time, social culture contexts, access social programs of recent governments after 2003 have directly influenced the spatial experience and consequently the electronic dance music scene. And here, it is important to emphasize that party occupations such as Praia da Estação, Duelo de MCs, and Carnaval de Rua directly influenced the action of electronic dance music collectives. Now, I had some considerations in this work. First, the bass is king. Low frequencies are so important to electronic dance music and make sense with the dimension of the body in a space. The bass encounters obstacles, architecture, other bodies, and various sensory materials, objects. The public and outdoor space finds new ways of making electronic dance music. Other consideration is about less nightclubs and more collectives. Since 1988, the Great Brazilian Disaster, there has been a strong relationship between the public and nightclub. With the collectives like Masterplano, there is a greater relationship between these bodies and unconventional space for the party, such as viaducts, soccer fields, squares, viewpoints. And here, there is also a demand on the part of the club and artists for an unprecedented experience in this space. Other consideration is about heterotopia, a notion by Foucault, different use of space. The nightclub experience, which in itself refers to the club, association, affiliation with an aesthetic and experience, has transformed in an affiliation more around the community or a certain identity of some electronic music collective. This inseparability between time and space, as suggested by the notion of chronotope, in presenting this. To the issues in force at these times, a desire to build new words, utopias, and even heterotopias, in the proportion to give new meaning to the use of the spaces of a city as Belo Horizonte. Thank you. I hope you sorry for my English.
Thank you very much.
My name is Rangel. I'm a Brazilian PhD student at UNESP of Araraquara. It's a great honor for me to be here today, but it's a great challenge because I'm not a fluent English speaker, like Sóstenes, and this is the first time that I'm speaking in English in front of an international audience. So, first of all, I'd like to apologize for any mistakes I may make during this presentation. And second place, unfortunately, I couldn't find an English translation of Piva's poems, so I had to quote them in Portuguese. I ask anyone who doesn't speak Portuguese to forgive me for this, and I promise to try to contextualize the quotes as best as I can. Finally, I prepared this paper to avoid as many mistakes as possible. So I'm going to start to reading. As an adept of shamanism, the Brazilian poet Roberto Piva had the hawk as his shamanic animal. A notorious predator of the forest, this bird of prey has an accurate vision, as well as the poet was a hunter of the concrete jungle, a nighttime cruiser in search of erotic prey, guided by his first gaze. This is what I had in mind when I gave the title of this paper: the hunt and the gaze, the movement and the capture. To this end, in this work, I attempt to reconstruct the historic queerscape, to use a concept coined by the geography Gordon Ingram, of São Paulo in the 60s, as well as the scene of the cruising, then move on to its spectral trails in Piva's poetry. Here, some photos of the poet. A singular figure in the Brazilian poetry scene of the second half of the 20th century, Piva is usually associated with the heterogeneous generation known as Geração 60, 16th generation. However, he's also circulated among the Brazilian surrealists and the generation known as Poetas Marginalized. Despite such affiliations, locate him in generational terms is not easy. His influences, which range from surrealism to the beat generation, from Dante Alighieri and William Blake to Arthur Rimbaud and Lautréamont, from Walt Whitman to the Brazilian modernist Mário de Andrade, display the image of a sui generis poet who mobilizes singularly some cardinal points of the modern poetry tradition. However, it's notable that Piva had a preference for molded poets with a nocturnal tone. In fact, the night not only figures as the setting of many of his poems, but also remains as a driving force in his poetics. It's possible to note this in the following poem that opens Paranoia, his first book. This is the cover. Here's the cover. Here, the quote, minha imaginação gritava no perpétuo impulso dos corpos encerrados pela noite. The night here is evoked as a divine entity, like a goddess that excites the poet's imagination and propels the bodies engulfed in her mantle. The hypnotic riffing of the poems complements the nocturnal atmosphere of the book, resulting in a dreamlike itinerary through the city's underworld, whereas the poet mixes with the beings of the urban landscape. A nocturnal São Paulo is presented in Piva's poetry, whose streets, avenues, corners, squares, and parks serve as a setting for the transit of a poetic voice driven by desire. Among the motifs of his poetry, I intend to highlight the homoerotic interactions that take place in decadent and highly eroticized public space. The vertiginous São Paulo of Piva's poetry was not so far from the real São Paulo of the time. According to his generation colleague, Claude Viller, São Paulo in the 60s was already a metropolis. In his reconstruction of the period, Viller points out that the youths of the time followed a common route, which passed through the center bars, crossed the Ipiranga and São João avenues, and continued along São Luís. At that time, Viller says, among the intellectuals and the marginalia that usually frequented this space, there was a remarkable presence of gay men in search of sexual partners. According to Viller's report, there is a certain atmosphere of liberation and association between artists, outsiders, and sexual dissidents, which prefigures the counterculture of the 70s. The common coexistence between Buena intellectuals and homosexual subculture is supported by the Brazilianist James Green, who points out the emergence of gay nightlife in São Paulo in the 60s, and along with it, the culture of cruising. In his history of homosexuality in 20th century Brazil, Green located a recurrent culture of homosexual encounters in public spaces since the turn of the century. These encounters became more common as the homosexual subculture grew in the main urban centers. The streets of São Paulo's downtown, for example, became a central place for these activities. Barbosa da Silva, a pioneer sociologist who mapped São Paulo's gay subculture in the late 50s, offers a significant picture of the time. At night, he says, the commercial and the financial city center gives way to an effervescent atmosphere of excess and voluptuousness. The area of gay interaction in São Paulo, according to Silva's delimitation, encompasses the streets of São João, Ipiranga, and São Luís, as well as the entire length of República Square, with an emphasis on its toilets. The anthropologist Nestor Perlonger, who carried out an ethnography of male prostitution in São Paulo in the 80s, classify the downtown region as a gay ghetto, a space in which takes place a great transit of individuals engaged in gay existential and sexual practices. The interactions took place mainly on foot, with a dynamic in which the gay ghetto tend to mix with other marginalized groups, such as prostitutes, transvestites, hustlers, and rascals. This mixture results in an ambience of lust and danger, sexual expectation, and hazard calculation. As David Bell and John Bean state, the street is a stage for sexual transgression, a treachery of cruelty and desire. Thus, the practice of cruising in São Paulo in the 60s stages a spectacle of poses and looks that involves mixed signals of seduction and risk. Moment, please. As we know, the tradition of walking through the streets reports back to the 19th century practice of flânerie, so present in Baudelaire's poems. The Baudelairean nighttime walks, which Elizabeth Bronfen analyzed in her book, reveal an underworld illuminated by urban lighting, a world of nightlife enthusiasts, the demons of the modern world. Thus, the urban night became a space-time of transgression and subversion of moral codes, as shown in the research of Brian Palmer. In turn, cruising can be seen, according to Mark Turner, as a queerification of flânerie. While the flaneur experiences the city as a distanced observer, the cruiser experiences it as a search for communion. Given the nature of his actions, the cruiser tends to prefer the night, his guardian and accomplice. The spectacle of cruising finds its ideal setting in the tension between urban lighting and nighttime darkness, transforming the street into a stage. Theatricalization is inherent to cruising, as the theorist Jack Parlett argues. It's a show of erotic poses in which acts of looking are intensified and eroticized. I quote. Fantasy, therefore, plays a vital role in this game, in which the desiring gaze constitutes an imaginative act of capture. Quote, it is through imaginary acts of consummation and connection with passing strangers that the cruising subject may find a way of heaven phenol. End of quote. Still according to Parlett, cruising consists of an elementary scene of looking, followed by a transposition of the observed to, quote, the erotic archive of the observer's mind. In this way, the object is transfigured into a masturbatory fantasy by the eye penis that fixes it. As highlighted by Turner, there is an inherently aesthetic excitement in this dynamic of erotic introjection. For him, the proper act of cruising holds a pleasure in itself. Quote, cruising is a process of walking, gazing, and engaging another or others, and it's not necessarily about sexual contact. There are many levels of erotic investment and fantasy that exist in the idea of the possible, the potential, but the wholly unrealized encounter. It's possible to find this kind of autonomous visual pleasure in which the observed and the imagined are intertwined in many of the poems that make up Piva's paranoia. In his book, we can identify several well-known points of the gay trance in the 60s. Topographies of the queer underworld of São Paulo's nightlife emerge like spectral geographies which charge vestiges of fortuitous encounters. These spaces, such as Ipiranga, São Luís, and Rio Branco avenues, as well as the squares and parks like Praça da República, Parque Ibirapuera, and Largo do Araújo, have an almost mythological status. As Bell and Beanie point out, locations like these are intimately interwoven with the imaginary of the local queer community. In other words, these places these are places where marks of queer consciousness are inscribed. Quote, streets where to walk is to enunciate queerness itself, right then. Throughout Paranoia, there are several references to a whole erotic universe of cinema theaters, and light panels, as well as street corners where strangers cruise. Quote, noite profunda de cinemas iluminados e lâmpada azul da alma desarticulando aos trombolhões pelas esquinas onde conheci os estranhos visionários da beleza. The neon lit panels provide a dreamy backdrop for flirting with the boys. Os luminosos me fitam do espaço iluminado. Quantos lindos garotos eu não vi sob esta luz. The poet's gaze captures the voluptuous movement of young men that are transformed into angels copulating in public toilets. Há anjos de Hilke dando o cu nos mictórios. In another verse, like a perverse parody of Picasso, the boys become saltimbancos making out in a dirty alley. Saltimbancos de Picasso conhecendo-se numa viela maldita. Several kinds of marginal figures appear in Piva's poems. The poet's delirious gaze places urban characters alongside religious entities, elevating fame to the same level. Eu vejo Brahma sentado em flor de lótus, Cristo roubando a caixa dos milagres, Chet Baker ganhando na vitrola. Eu vejo putos, putas, patacos, torres, chumbo, chapas, chopes, vitrinas, homens, mulheres, pederastas e crianças cruzam-se e abrem-se em mim como lua, gás, rua, árvores, lua, medrosos repúdios. Sorry. A moment, please. All these images, these figures, cross the poet's gaze and body, which becomes an extension of the space. Poet and seat merge, the body is citified, as Elizabeth Gross puts it, breaking the limits between the self and the world. Thus, a perverse space, as understood by Victor Bergin, is produced. According to Bergin, the object's centrality is lost in this process, and the being dissolves into space. The imagery becomes changeable, just as scenes slide and collide. Nothing's fixed, everything is mobile, points out Bergin. For whom the perverse space is the space of polymorphic visuality. In other words, it's a field of scopic pleasure that allows the flow of fragmentary images of the unconscious. There's an orgiastic quality in this, similar to Jack Parley's analysis of cruising in Walt Whitman's poetry. Like in Whitman, the dizzying flow of figures that cross the poet's gaze in Piva's poetry mirrors the riffing of the urban modernity, with its fleeting glances and transitory encounters. As Richard Parker writes, quotes, the urban space becomes eroticized precisely because of its perceived impersonality and unpredictability. On the other hand, there are idyllic places like Arouche, República, or Ibirapuera, Edenic nooks within the metropolis. These spaces invert the romantic trope of solitude, becoming a place of communion. No Ibirapuera, esta noite eu perdi minha solidão. End of quote. In an angelic Ibirapuera park, the poet watches a war of hats and boys with white lacerations, an image that can be read as an allusive open-air orgy. Eu assistia a uma guerra de chapéus e as brancas lacerações dos garotos no Ibirapuera angélico. In another poem, Republic Square, a notorious public sex spot, becomes a dreamlike setting. As night falls, mictórios tomam lugar na luz, like characters that take position on the elite stage, preparing for the sexual spectacle. It's a toilet. The inhabitants of the square, from pederasts to prostitutes, intertwine themselves in a synesthetic vision evocative of Rimbaud. Há jovens pederastas embebidos em lilás e putas com a noite passeando em torno de suas unhas. Há uma gota de chuva na cabeleira abandonada, enquanto o sangue faz naufragar as corolas. Ó minhas visões, lembranças de Rimbaud, Praça da República dos meus sonhos. Then, the square becomes a delirious paradise of sexual ecstasy. Delirium tremens diante do paraíso, bundas, glabras, sexos de papel, anjos deitados nos canteiros, cobertos de cal, água fumegante nas privadas, cérebros sulcados de acenos. The reference to hairless buttocks, lying down angels, steaming urinals, and seductive gestures allow us to visualize a static picture made up of juxtaposed scenes. The final result is something like a metonymic orgy, created only by allusions and partial elements. In addition to Rimbaud, who appears in the previous poem, other poets are presented as Piva's night companions. Lautréamont, for example, figures as a guy whom the poet meets on the steps of Santa Cecilia. The looking exchange results in an encounter. The French writer waits for a Brazilian poet in a kind of sanctuary on Largo do Arouche. Eu vejo Lautréamont num sonho nas escadas de Santa Cecília. Ele me espera no Largo do Arouche, no ombro de um santuário. In another poem, Mário Andrade appears in Ibirapuera Park. He assumes the form of an angel of solitude, sitting on the poet's shoulders. Piva imagines Mário, a reputed homosexual, asking the boys who occupy the park's lawn, "É você meu girassol?" the poet asks. At the end of the poem, the younger poet walks alongside the older one, hand in hand, into the night. Agora, Mário, enquanto os anjos adormecem, devo seguir contigo de mãos dadas noite adiante. Não só o desespero estrangula nossa impaciência, também nossos passos embebem as noites de calafrios. Between Piva and Mário, there seems to exist not only a communion, but also a kind of pedagogy, a nocturnal, erotic pedagogy between man and a fig. Last but not least, it's important to highlight that in Piva's poetry, not only the poet, but also the cities turned on. Throughout the book, we can find images like this one of phallic chimneys dilating as if in an erection. A cidade com chaminés crescendo. As Gross points out, the city is inscribed in bodies and reflects them. The urban body is a simulacrum of the physical body. It is therefore the city body with its phallic profusion of posts, bricks, walls, handrails, stairs, chimneys, and roofs that the poet cruises. So, throughout this brief exposition, I sought to present some ways in which cruising, this queer culture of looking, appears in Roberto Piva's poetry, specifically in Paranoia, but which continues to permeate his later work. The poet makes his poetic walk through the streets of São Paulo a frantic sequence of encounters with the beings of the night. Then, Piva's poetry can be understood as a sensorial orgy, a communion between the poet, the night, and its inhabitants. Although the sense of sight dominates, it's the entire body, both the poet and the cities, that's transformed into a sexualized spatiality, and therefore into a stage for the erotic performance of cruising. Finally, the erotic tension that exists in each look is transposed to the poems themselves, which become fetishized objects. As Paris states, the poets attempt to fix the transitory encounters through writing, turns the play with language into an aesthetic object of masturbatory pleasure, a way of giving fan continuity through the poetic experience. And that's it. Thank you for the attention. Sorry for the mistake. Here are my items.
Thank you very much.
I hear you. I don't know if you can hear me well.
Yes, and we can see the slides.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll start. Thank you for having me. Today, we're gonna talk about a very specific topic. It's basically the representation of urban night in movies that's centered around Casablanca. I'm gonna dive in right. So the selected movies are productions from like a specific period of time. It's spanning from early 2000s until now. And what's specific, well, we should also note that all the filmmakers are basically cis men. But what's specific is that all the movies that were made to address like political themes, and Moroccan filmmakers often employ symbolic detours rather than direct approach to events. They use local context as the closest implicit expression of political discourse. And what's specific is all the movies were centered around Casablanca because the city has been through a lot of like riots and uprisings, a lot of like urban change. So it was a focus in terms of movies. But when these movies were made in the focus of urban space and urban questions, they sort of like created a pattern around the night. And so they portrayed the city through film because of political expression, and in our case here, they also did portray the night, and it became the opposite of like empty and mute, and the city and the night became like paradigms used to conceptualize like an effect of reality. And so the urban will be expressed as a site of frustration and disillusionment, but they will do this through the night basically. And so Casablanca was like very an almost perfect setting, very emblematic, full of contradictions, like really a place of conversions, a time of space of birth that attracts and repels. And so these films basically contributed to the construction of striking images and imagery and symbolism about like nightlife in Casablanca, and it become like a sort of laboratory of nocturnal visuals connected to basically spatial segments. So we will mostly, like the next slides, we will mostly explore like aspects of the urban nights in these films and through a more open exploratory approach. So we're not going to focus on a specific ideology or a specific pre-existing theory, but we will just start from the premise that sociology is very often based on visuality. We always observe. So we're going to try to do the same thing with these movies. And the most basically common methods include image, symbols, analysis, and document examination. So it's basically like we're gonna base on interpretation of visual elements to understand social knowledge, while also considering a bit like the possibility of over interpretation, but we'll basically focus on the content that depicts like normative narratives, not through repetition, but through consistency. And I want to point out here that, I analyzed like 12 movies, and one might argue that, well, it's repetition, it's just repetitive narratives that portrays and reproduce the same narratives of around the night. But I would argue back that it's not about repetition, it's more about like having like a consistent and a persistent like narrative around the night, which is interesting because as we know that artistic expressions are like by essence singular, but I think we will examine the content that it's produced and dissect it as a rearranged effect of reality by these filmmakers. And so basically, the point is that between cinematographic representation and sociological objectification, there is no true reproduction of reality, basically, in two cases. But our interest in these filmmakers is mostly about like how they construct like cinematographic forms of social objectification. And so the aim is basically to explain like the social clarity of these filmmakers and their ability to construct like narratives, schemes, and context around the urban night and how they characterize a sense of like the social. So yeah, so of course, like there is like a construction of time and space with different aspects like narration, the paradox, the characters, but we basically look how overall they build the imaginary around the urban night while trying to address like political issues of urban like changes in Moroccan cities. So these are the movies. I'm not gonna like start here, but they're all like condensed in the same period between 2000, 2003. Some of them are made in the same year, but all produced and made by men, cis men, and most of them have like the names of the city in the titles, but they all have like aspects of the night included in the plot. So yeah, so the first aspect here I'm going to show you like sort of like screenshots of like scenes, but I didn't include a lot because it's going to be very condensed and very saturated, but I'm just going to like dive in and like specific like imagery that keeps like coming back in all these movies. And the first aspect is basically compressed and claustrophobic aspect of urban night. So the recurring imagery of diminished characters, they are trapped around tall buildings, surrounded by suffocating emptiness of the night, and they often experience the night through a sense of compression, entrapment, and it is presented as repetitive cycles within a closed nocturnal atmosphere. It's gritty, it's black, it's dark, and the tall buildings are always there, as we see in these scenes from like different movies. They're always roaming aimlessly, and they're like surrounded by the darkness of the sky, the building, and the claustrophobic visuals emphasize like is often presented by confining the characters, as I said, in the same district, in the same area, in the same neighborhood. It's always in the middle of the city of Casablanca, the center, the European neighborhoods, because it's where like it all erupts, like politically speaking, riots, demonstrations, and manifestations. And yeah, so they seem like to go in circles, yet simultaneously, like at the same time they are trapped. They express this feeling of like vastness of the city, how big the city and how monstrous it is. And another aspect that keeps repeating in the same scenes is running. And it appears like it is often a motive to explain this compressed nature of Casablanca's night. So yeah, so the night is referred to as the social situation of non-escape, and by really putting like towering architecture that portrays like an oppressive nature. And the other like aspect that is interesting in the imagery is recurring figures of the night. Here from I'm gonna also show you like screenshots, but it's mostly like the urban night in these films doesn't serve as a passive setting, but actively interacts with the characters through recurring figures, and they constitute what I can call like the decor of the urban nights. They are identifiable. You can see them, you can know them, you can identify them, put names on them, uh, but they are like very decorative characters. They are unexplored like storylines, yet a passive expected element to see in the depiction of the urban night in these films. And they are often like introduced as a subversive element of the night, yet they remain predictable and constant. They are subversive, but they are expected to have in the night. And some of these figures are like, I can cite, like there's the drunk, the fool, I'm gonna call it the fool between the brackets, the queer, the sex worker, the homeless, stray animals, and the police. And like they are recurring in these movies all the time. You can see like these like sort of like recurring figures. And these characters not only make up like an essential part of the night landscape, but they master the night. Like they know how to roam around the night. Like they blend into the urban landscape, they appropriate it, and they symbolize like a sense of visible anonymity. You don't know them, they don't have names, but also like they're very visible and they're very known, and they constitute like the character aspect of the urbanite. And another aspect is queerness as a prop. It also goes into the category of using like queerness and queer people as recurrent figures of the night. You will never see them in daylight, but gender non-confirming and queer signaling characters are often presented as the nocturnal landscape, and they are portrayed most of the time through sex work that it's mainly and visually attached to the nightlife and urban scape. They're always like portrayed through sex work, and most of the visualization of queerness through these films aim to frame these individuals like in a spatial urban set and the parameters that is defined by night atmosphere. You will not see them in daylight, and when you see them in the night, they are in specific spots of the city, and they mostly like presented as sex workers. And if you're not gonna like see them as sex workers in specific like urban parameters, there's another aspect where we're gonna like have queer signaling characters, which is through private spaces, where we will see other queer signaling characters express themselves in closet private spaces, very hesitant, very very shy. However, you will only see them express like this sort of like queerness during the night, even in closed places, as we see like in the two down screenshots. It's not very explicit, it's very implicit, but it's very attached to the night, even like in indoor spaces. Talking about like this aspect of like outside and inside, there's also like this continuum of opposites where we have like two aspects of like continuity when it comes to portraying the urban night through these films. So there are two, like as I said, two radical heterogeneous coexisting words. So we have the rich and the poor. In these films, you will rarely see the rich word or the rich experience around the urban night. So they don't depict the wealthy's night directly, but rather the word is referenced through the eyes of main characters who do not belong to it but remain observant. And they exaggerate it. They tend to either like over romanticize it or de-romanticize it. But you see like the two versions of the night interact. And another aspect, which is it's like very about like the underscoring of isolation and constraints of inside and private nightlife. So the night landscape extends indoors, where we see insomniatic characters, troubled family dynamic, domestic violence, and other characters that look like trapped in private spaces. But also it's not about the specific space, it's about how the night kind of create like this estrangement and confinement of the night that penetrates even like private spaces. And we can see that like how the camera moves from interior spaces to exterior ones, how they capture like really like vital relationship between like the private and the public. And spatial visualization mostly aims at framing like individuals in a very specific urban frames and parameters, and they are mostly like defined by the night. And another aspect which I kind of like interests me personally because it goes like into what I do in my PhD research, which is like functional nightlife. And one of the other like repetitiveness that we see, it's how Casablanca is portrayed as chaotic and constantly moving, with characters roaming the streets with a sense of like ownership and appropriation of space and knowledge of the space and how space time configuration works. And the urban night is also presented as organized time space and functioning rigorously. And we have three persistent elements in all of these movies, which is bars, food, and taxis. And by the presence of, for example, small taxis, which demonstrate that the night is both accessible and functional, these taxis serves as a tool for like the characters to access to mobility translates to access to nightlife. So as long as we see taxis in the city, then we can access nightlife because they provide light, but also they provide like mobility between spaces. And also food stops, they kind of give like the sort of like allure that the night is endless, because food stops, street food play a similar role as taxis, as do bars. Basically, these elements are persistent component of the urban night, how it is characterized, and they are often presented in several films, and they're mostly like attached to where the bar is, because it's like this logic of like street vendors around the night. And yeah, as we can see, like these are different movies, but it's like the same elements like persist. And the last element that I think is very important is how the night is also portrayed as a catalyst of change. So while like in the daytime, we're gonna see like these characters like hints at their ambitions and dreams and their plans for life, it's basically at night where they're supposed to, like their true self supposed like to emerge, and the night is often where they actualize. It really serves as like a catalyst of transformation for these characters, and it is specifically illustrated like through instance of sudden violence, as the night often represents the culmination of events that leaves a chaotic hangover in the daylight. We see like manifestations, eruption of violence that occurs during the night, and we see the effects of it in the daylight. As simple as we see in the daylight a scene where like the trash cans are broken down, and we see the trash in the street, and at the night we see, okay, it's a stray dog who pushed it down, it's like a dumpster diver who pushed it down. So most of like these aspects are related to the night, as if the night is the main convergence point of transformation. And like, as I said, violence is also a present and constant figure. I didn't like mention it with the other figures, basically because it's an active point in the narrative, and the transformation between night and day is deliberately not smooth, as characters really do carry like that lingering feeling of the nocturnity into the daylight hours. And yeah, so basically, the point is that it's a 12 movies that have like a plot around the city and how chaotic, and try to translate like the socio-political aspects of the city through the movies and through the scenes. And they do, however, create a pattern around the night, knowingly or not, but you can notice it. And the exploration of urban night imagery patterns is really an understanding how like normative narrative and aesthetics are built around nocturnity through artistic expressions. And these normative narratives are not to be taken like easily, because they do create like a sort of like impact and influence on people's representation about the night. And the nocturnal city do like exhibit like through these representation of reality effect like certain bidirectional aspects. So we do have like an emphasis on socio-material settings of the night and representation, and how it creates like figures of its own visibility. And the night and the city at night, it doesn't just become like a context, a setting, but it's rather like really like a character, an object of analysis on its own. And the urban night itself, as I said, it becomes like a recurring character, as these filmmakers really build around it like a rationality and an active aspect, that instead of considering the night a passive setting in a passive context, but it's like more of like an interactive aspect, and with the individuals during in the city. So yeah, just to go back to the main point, which is the main sociological aspect, which is very much methodological. I work on ethnography of the city at night, and understanding these films is also more about how to approach the urban night as an active object and objectification of reality, rather than, as I said, temporal context. So yeah, this is all. Thank you for listening, and yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, and I would like to say that it's my first time presenting in English, but it's not. Anyway, it doesn't make my English any better, nor my anxiety management. But I'm very glad to be here to this conference, and it was super interesting for me to hear your presentation, and I'm looking forward for the next ones, because it's not strictly my field of studies, but it's something I feel connected with. So I'm happy to be here, and also to have the chance to present this. It is just an idea of research, it's a research proposal, it's not already well developed or finished yet. But this allows me to look at the object of my research, which is graffiti writing from a different standpoint compared to my usual one, which is the urban impact of graffiti and street art, the aesthetic consequences of the use of those objects in the urban landscape. Instead, today, what I want to deal with is the relation between graffiti writing practice and the nighttime. Why I came to this idea. I've been interviewing graffiti writers for like 4 or 5 years now, and the nighttime has a very important role in their narratives. But I was trying to find something that specifically addressed this issue, and I couldn't find anything. Maybe it's just my personal difficulty in finding literature, I don't know, but I couldn't find much. And I was really surprised, because most graffiti is done at night. And for the approach, so like these emotional feelings and emotion embodied experience. The reason is that graffiti writing as a performative practice is highly, it involves the body in a strong way, and also it's not a practice that gives any social reward or any economic reward. And so what drives writers to start and to keep doing graffiti writing is the rewards that they get in terms of feelings and sensations. And finally, I think that graffiti can be an interesting standpoint to look at what Rangel calls the nocturnal paradox, which is this ambiguity in the meaning that we can give to nighttime as both time of freedom from conventional constraints, normative way of living, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's it causes fear and tensions and anxiety. Okay, so my interest is to understand how graffiti writers make experience of the night, specifically a bodily and sensorial experience, in the peculiar temporalities and rhythms of the night. So ideally, I would like to deal with the night as just not in comparison with the day, because there's always this comparison, in the night, because it's not the day. Instead, I would like to look at the night in itself, with the differences and comparison that can happen within the night, which is something I wasn't able to do with my preliminary and explorative interviews, but the idea is to reach this. Okay, so as I was saying, I think that this research could fill a huge gap in the literature, but also it's another way to look at the tensions and ambiguities that characterize graffiti writing practice in itself, starting from the definition of graffiti writing, which is not clear, to all other aspects of this practice. And also it can be helpful to actually understand why graffiti writers do what they do, which seems to be very important for local administration to fight against this. At least they might understand better what graffiti writers are actually doing. Methodologically speaking, I plan to rely, of course, on qualitative methodology, because it's a research question that would be hard to answer with statistical methods, especially if you're asking for sensorial experience or emotional experiences. But I think that it's not enough to use what I usually, the techniques I mostly rely on in my researches or interviews and focus groups. And I would like to expand these techniques, because I think that for research questions that are strictly connected with emotions and feelings and the body, other more innovative methods could be more helpful. So maybe someone who has experience in that can help me, and the data analysis later. I don't know. I would call them more main themes than results, because they are not actual results. But I found interesting, first thing, this, which was also mentioned in the presentation before, so the night as the possibility to encounter with the other, which is both the other as someone that is not me, or someone that is not the usual social categories or social groups with which we enter in contact, but also the other as the other part of the self, which can actually somehow be the true self, the person one actually feels without social constraints, like what W says, maybe, I don't know, because translating is always hard, but he's making it clear, for me at least in Italian, and at least during the interview it was clear. He was saying, like, during the day I need to be this kind of person just to meet social expectations. I'm working in a restaurant, so of course I have to smile and to be nice and whatever. And then when I go out and do my pieces, I can feel like actually myself, and this also like feeling their true self makes the nighttime and also the encounter of the others, which are marginalized social categories. I don't remember how I started the sentence, but makes them feel more safer, even though it could be like thought as hard to understand this. I'm in the middle of categories of people that are stigmatized and are considered as problematic or someone who's risky to be close to. Instead, they feel more comfortable and safer in that environment, more than working in a restaurant and having to smile to common people, if this means anything. And also, I think it's very interesting the fact that they define themselves as part of the ecosystem of the night, with junkies, homeless, and prostitutes. So there's this sense of belonging. Here it's just a highlight in one. In a couple of sentences, they combine all the different feelings that arise when practicing graffiti at night, which on the one hand we have fear and anxiety, because of course they are doing something that is illegal and criminalized, at least in most countries. But on the other side, there's liberation, and so we are in front of reappropriation of time and space through bodily practices. And in this excerpt, for me, it's interesting. So here is the comparison I was talking about before, but it's still interesting because there's the destabilization of the sensorial system that is caused by the nighttime. If during the day we have light and like it's the time of work, so there's also noise, a lot of people awake and doing conducting businesses and everything. The night instead is time of darkness and silence. So if during the day the side is the most important sense for those who can see, of course, during the night the hearing becomes more important. So it would be interesting for me to develop a bit better this dimension on how to reconstruct the use of the senses in different timings of the action of the night action of graffiti writers.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Okay, so
We all coming here, or I
maybe,
can?
yeah, the speakers can all join so that you're all together. Center stage.